All right, hello everyone. Welcome back to CHRTC 309. So, of course, as always, this is Sociology of Youth and Religion. All right, so in this lecture, we're going to take a look at some work from Melinda Lundquist Denton, along with Linda Pierce. So Denton went off, left Christian Smith, went on and got her own fabulous job, and kept working on this kind of question of youth and religion. And her opinions here are a little bit different than what Christian Smith had, and she comes up with some different categories along with Pierce for analyzing particularly religious change, in the emerging adult years. So let's have a look at that. All right, so what Pierce and Denton talk about, or one of the first things they talk about, is the fact that when we talk about religion, we can talk about essentially two big categories, right? So we can talk about the dynamic, right? And that's the part of your religious life that's going to vary over time, right? And I mean, that's just like not everything stays the same, right? When you were a kid, right, you had a certain religious faith, right? It looked like the faith of a child, if you had any, at all, of course. It looked like the faith of a child. Why? Because you were a child, right? Because, at the end of the day, you were a kid. And you had a pretty simple faith. It probably relied pretty heavily on your parents in terms of the, reassuring the content and those sorts of things. And so that's going to change over time, right? You enter adolescence, you start taking more ownership of what you think, what you believe. You might shift some things, abandon some beliefs, move to different beliefs, that sort of thing. And so things are going to be dynamic. That's the dynamic part. The static part is basically the consistency, right? Like most people will remain, for the most part, within the tradition that they were born in, certainly within the religion that they were born in, right? It's some people might switch around from mainline to evangelical, or from Catholic to evangelical, or across those lines. But people switching from, say, Christian to Mormon or Christian to Muslim is not impossible, but it's fairly rare. There is a consistency, right, in the expression of most people's religion and spirituality. It goes in a spectrum. It's hard to move, say someone who grew up Catholic to something else, because there is that consistency, right? When they think of religion, that is what they think of. So that's the static part of religious faith.
Right, so religious change, relatively common, right? Essentially, in a lot of ways, religion seems to take the form that people need at different periods in their lives, right? People need different things from their spirituality or religion, and it tends to reshape itself based on those experiences, right? Because a 14-year-old doesn't need the same things as a 40-year-old, doesn't need the same things as a 60-year-old. So, religious experiences will take the form that people need at different points in their lives. Dramatic change, though, say change from one faith to another, or total transformations, relatively rare. And when they do happen, they tend to happen pretty slowly, right? You don't generally wake up one day and realize that you are now an atheist, and yesterday, you were a firm 100% Bible-believing evangelical Protestant, right? These things tend to roll up over time. And for most people, right, there are always exceptions, and the exceptions, you can find press accounts of them. They're relatively rare, right? Most people's religiosity is relatively unchanging over time, right? So what we see, broadly speaking, we've talked about it through the course, people who had kind of a deep religious faith growing up generally don't change to having no religious faith. It happens sometimes, but it's not terribly common. When we see people going from faith to no faith, we're generally seeing people who weren't all that active in their faith commitments prior. And so, like, if you look at someone's faith kind of at different points in their life, like cross-sectionally, you take kind of moments at different times in their life, what you should be able to discern broadly is a kind of general shape with some changes kind of moving around that core. So I guess like a moon, like the changes are like a moon kind of orbiting around a central, stable kind of planet. Okay, so generally when we're talking about religiosity, we can say that religiosity, in the way that sociologists typically measure it, is made up of kind of things in three categories. So there's the content, right? So what people believe, right? What is it that people actually believe? And to what extent do they kind of assent to the particular beliefs of the religion that they belong to? Conduct, what do they do, right? I mean, the easiest thing, and the one that we typically default to in terms of measuring conduct, is church attendance. But frequency of prayer is another good one that we can use to determine religiosity. And then centrality, asking people how important their religious faith is in their lives, right? Like, how do they feel very close to God? Is it very important to them? Is it not particularly important to them? Like, how important is this to them at the end of the day? Okay. The way that Denton and Pierce kind of set up how people's religiosity and kind of their religious and spiritual life story ends up looking is they describe it as a mosaic. Basically, they say that individuals have a personal religious mosaic that they create and they modify over time, right? And so, they use the metaphor of like, it's made up of different colored tiles. So it's like putting together a kind of picture or an image or a symbol or whatever it happens to be. And what they say is different people might have different colored tiles available to them, right? Not everybody comes from the same spiritual background, right? So someone who grew up in, say, an evangelical faith might not have as much of the, say, mystic tradition or the contemplative tradition of Christianity available to them as, say, someone who grew up in the Eastern Orthodox tradition or in the Catholic tradition. So they have different things available to them from which they can construct a religious identity. Right? And this is true of anybody and any kind of identity you're building. You don't have endless resources available to you. Everybody has kind of limited resources available to them, limited sources of influence. You can't be something that you have absolutely no familiarity with. You wouldn't grow up in like somewhere like America in the 1950s and decide that you're a Muslim, right? Because that set of religious tiles is simply not available to you. So people can only build identities out of the things that they actually have, right? It's not all up to personal choice or decisions, right? You are, to some extent, shaped by the environment around you. And while people can, in some circumstances, transcend this environment, it tends to be that people build their identities and their religious and spiritual identities out of the materials that are available to them at the end of the day. And much of this is just a result of circumstance. So not to dwell on this, because we went over these earlier in the course, right? We have our alliterative 5 categories of religion according to Denton and Pierce, right? We have our abiders, our highest probability of giving religious answers, and all the way down to our atheists, right? And you can read over the slide if you need to familiarize yourself with that. Okay, so according to Denton and Pierce, and here Denton is in a sense maybe revising some of her thesis from Soul Searching, what she says is adolescents in the abider category, that most religious category, kind of like the devout in Smith and Denton and Smith and Snell, generally had the best life outcomes, better than every other category, with the exception of that bottom category, the atheists, which had very nearly statistically identical life outcome scores. Her theory is that a lot of this actually may have to do with the fact that the abiders and the atheists tend to come from a similar socioeconomic caste, highly educated parents, parents who are typically married, who have the ability to support them. The fact is that the atheist category and the abider category in a lot of ways were very similar, right? You had generally people from very similar kind of social castes. And that accounted for the fact that they ended up with similar life outcomes a little bit more in Smith and Denton's, than in Smith and Denton's research. And one of the things that Denton says is that in that initial research, they lumped people together, like they lumped the atheists in with the disengaged, right? They didn't have a category specifically for the atheists, and that this may have actually skewed the data in some ways. So to talk about the way that teenagers and emerging adults acquire faith, Denton and Pierce borrow a metaphor and a kind of concept from the field of education, which is scaffolding. And scaffolding is basically the process where a teacher or another authority figure models or demonstrates how to solve a problem, and then basically steps back, lets the person solve problems for themselves, but offers support when necessary. And what Denton and Pierce say is that basically adolescents thrive when they're surrounded by social scaffolding that offers both space to grow in their newly acquired autonomy and guidance to help them figure out what to do with it, right? So it's a careful balance, right? When you have both space to stretch your legs and be out on your own, and at the same time, someone there to kind of back you up. That's when they see things as basically working really well, broadly speaking, across life outcomes, right? The basic, not just in religiosity. The religiosity is obviously a behavior that they're going to want to talk about, but across a broad range of life outcomes, that's where people tend to do really well when they're scaffolded properly. So adolescence, according to Pierce and Denton, is a really important time, a time where a lot of identity is being set, specifically because, at the end of the day, it's the time that people are separating from their parents, they're creating their own identities, they're trying things out on their own. There's a ton of possible outcomes, positions, values that young people need to contend with, right? Like they're, just in the realm of, say, sexuality, do they follow their religion's teachings on sexuality? Do they follow more of the cultural norm, which is, basically to have sex as frequently as possible. In politics, are they a liberal, a conservative, a Republican, a Democrat? There's this whole range of things that they're trying to get their head around. They're basically getting ready to enter the adult world, but they're not ready to manage it alone. And increasingly, it looks like they're not ready to manage it until they're well into their 20s, unfortunately, as this period of trying out life in emerging adulthood has really lengthened out. But really, definitely not until they're 18. They're just trying to get a sense of who they are and where who they are fits in the world. So there's basically three groups that seem to scaffold towards religious change in adolescence: parents and other important adults. So this could be youth pastors, teachers, professors, peers, obviously friends, and religious institutions. So the process that Denton and Pierce identify as probably the one that's most likely to lead to a mature kind of adult faith is what they call contingent responding. And basically contingent responding involves what this is, a back and forth conversation in which the scaffolding agent, whoever that happens to be, whether it's a parent, a peer, pastor, someone from the religious institution, basically responds. It's a back and forth conversation where basically they are responding to whatever the teenager or emerging adult's comments and questions are in a way that keeps the conversation going. And here, we should distinguish this from giving pat answers. And this is, the kind of difference here. There is a tendency, I think, and lots of people have commented on this, that a lot of religious groups have sort of preset answers to what some of the concerns are that young people have with faith, with religion. And this can be anything, right? Whether it be sexuality, whether it be, why is there evil in the world, right? Why do bad things happen to good people? There are sets of pat answers that can be really unhelpful. And I mean, sometimes these are well-intentioned and well-meaning. People will say after a loved one died, oh, they're in a better place, or everything happens for a reason. These are generally things that are meant to shut down the conversation rather than keep the conversation going. And while they're well-intentioned, right, what Pierce and Denton sort of suggest is that they don't let the person come to their own conclusions. They don't present a range of options, a range of ideas, a range of possible ways that a faith group ends up dealing with a lot of these questions. They sort of just shut everything down. And part of the reason here is probably an insecurity on the part of, say, a scaffolding agent, where they simply feel threatened perhaps by the question being asked. Not necessarily, but potentially. And therefore, they give the kind of pat answer. Maybe they don't understand it that well themselves, so they give a sort of pat answer at the end of the day, and that's where that comes from. This, unfortunately, doesn't tend to keep conversations going. They'll tend to shut conversations down and often leave, the person that was needing scaffolding in exactly the same place as they were when they began. So basically, yeah, according to Pierce and Denton, contingent responding generally gives the right degree of scaffolding, right? It builds up their faith and lets the young person then refine their religious thinking on their own, rather than, the two alternatives, which is over scaffolding and under scaffolding, which we'll talk about in a second. And generally what happens when you have someone who is in this mode of contingent responding, the person that they're dealing with the young person will often and typically refine their faith, the one that they were raised in, into, an adult kind of faith. It is personalized though. Like there is no magical formula for this. Um, and basically, the person who's being scaffolded, they turn the faith into their own faith, right? They take the concepts that they can take and they turn it into, a faith of their own, which is the title of the book. And I think appropriately so, because at the end of the day, what I think Denton and Pierce note in the book, which I think is an interesting and useful insight, is that the faith of the next generation, millennials, Zoomers, whatever comes after Zoomers, is never exactly the faith of their parents, right? It is similar in its outlines in a lot of ways, but through that process of personalization and individualization, it always becomes something slightly different as well. So kind of what I was talking about on the last slide, one of the dangers obviously is over scaffolding, right? Putting too much structure, being too restrictive, not giving enough room for honest questions and doubts. And this is, a mistake, according to Denton and Pierce. That basically, again, while it's well-intentioned, at the end of the day, one of the things with over scaffolding, right? This might be like to give pat answers, to surround people with a bunch of books and literature and structures that give them quick, easy answers to these questions, but not let people deal with those questions themselves, not let them wrestle with things. And so it sort of shuts down the ability to run. And basically, typically this is done because people are trying to guarantee an outcome, right? And I mean, you can see here, especially in late modernity, in the society we live in, where we're being told, every couple of months that religion is fading away, faith is dying, the nuns are it. There's not going to be the NONES. The nuns are it, right? Religion is going to be gone, and people of faith are just going to have to deal with the fact that nobody cares about their beliefs. I think the tendency there can be over scaffolding, right? Where it's like we have to protect our young people from the world by giving them all of the pat answers right up in front. Make sure that they don't have to deal with these questions. When they have questions, we have answers ready, and it's not a process of working it out for yourself. And by trying to guarantee that outcome, you can actually weaken the ability to refine that into an adult religion. And then people sort of get stuck, right? Because what they know is the pat answers. They know maybe the faith of their childhood, and they sort of get stuck assuming that that's what faith is. And that, in face of the adult world, tends to fall apart. So over scaffolding can leave people unprepared, in religious terms, for adulthood and for some of the challenges and the struggles of adulthood. And so, it is a real danger. Okay, so obviously at the other pole would be under scaffolding, right? Not giving enough support and just having a kind of hands-off approach. And I was just reading someone's kind of account of growing up, where basically, they said that their parents took them to a Buddhist temple, a mosque, a Catholic church, a Hindu temple, and basically their thing was like, oh, well, we want you to decide what you believe on your own, right? This is under scaffolding, right? Like, young people, broadly speaking, are not equipped to figure out for themselves what they believe at the end of the day. They require some kind of guidance through a lot of these questions from the trusted figures in their lives, right? And where, say, potentially parents might abdicate that responsibility, while peers and other kind of groups, maybe the internet, Reddit, might step in to kind of scaffold people in different directions. Basically, I think this comes from a sort of other fear, right? Which is, I don't want to indoctrinate my children. I don't want to indoctrinate people. I want to let my kid, where I've typically heard it in kind of personal accounts is parents who are like, well, I was indoctrinated as a kid. I grew up in a very religious family, so I really want to let my kids just figure this out on their own. Okay, I mean, again, I think well-intentioned, but young people, and this is true whether it's in careers, whether it's in sexuality, whether it is in really anything, right? Young people, adolescents, emerging adults need guides in their lives to help them sort out some of the aspects that they aren't ready to figure out, that they haven't quite moved into adulthood. They're experiencing a lot of things for the first time, and they still need a lot of those guides and a lot of those helpful people to help them sort out. And basically, under scaffolding, leaves young people adrift. And typically when you're adrift, though not always, what ends up happening is you're sort of pulled along with the current of the predominant culture. So teenagers do have a great deal of agency in figuring out their religious identities, right? And there are no guarantees, right? If you are, and maybe you'll face this at some point with your own children or with people in your lives, teenagers that you care about, brothers, sisters. There are no guarantees, right? Even with good scaffolding, you don't control all of the inputs. No one does. So there is no guarantee of what conclusion a teen will draw, right? Teenagers from religious families might decide that religion is not for them, even with those appropriate social supports. It happens. It happens all the time. I know lots of people for whom this is the case. Teens from non-religious families might end up becoming religious. This happens all the time as well, right? And this can be very disruptive for people who, grew up with no religion or tried to raise their children with no religion. A young person, discovering religion and identifying as religious can be a really disruptive experience, but it happens, right? Even with the best intention, even with the best policies, even with the best programs, it happens. And I know, like, one of the pastors at a church that some friends of mine go to, actually the place where I play ball hockey on Sunday nights when we're not being starved of human contact by a deadly pandemic. The pastor, has a teenage son, or 3 teenagers. 2 of them are churchgoers. One of them basically agnostic atheist. Same family, same inputs, basically, just different turnout. There are no guarantees, right? Even for pastors, even for religious figures, it doesn't matter. There's no guarantees. Generally, peers for the most part don't talk to their peers about religious questions in the adolescent years. They tend to compartmentalize religion from other parts of their lives. Denton and Pierce basically say, like, on the surface, they don't talk to each other. If there's any influence, it tends to be at the level of the passive, right? They see, encouragement in the religious identities of their peers, right? They might see a peer that they see as really great, who's living a wonderful example of a religious person who they really admire, and they might want to be more like that person. And I think you saw a little bit of that, say, in the documentary Soul Searching. I don't know, it feels like that was a million years ago, but I think we did see a little bit of that. Others obviously might be discouraged by their peers from engaging in serious religious considerations. It's going to depend on the circumstances, right? It might be someone who's way over religious and that discourages someone, or a culture that tends to mock religious people. Both of these things, or many others, could be true in terms of dissuading teenagers from asking or really engaging in serious religious considerations. Obviously, religious communities where people are engaged with them can be formative experiences, right? Youth will thrive typically on personal relationships with peers and supportive adults in the community, right? So communities that are working towards, helping young people develop their religious identities need to have networks of supportive adults and peers that people can turn to and discuss with, and all of these things. Young people tend to be energized by action, and part of it is they like to see what it looks like, because the experience of, say, going to church on a Sunday is a fairly passive one, right? Especially in the model of religion that has tended to predominate in the West, right? You go, if you're in a liturgical tradition, you go through the liturgy, right? There's some singing, some prayers, probably communion, if you're Christian. In other religions, right, there are different rituals that you go through. If you were, say, in a low church tradition of Christianity, there's probably some rock and roll singing, a 45-minute sermon, and then you go have coffee out in the lobby. This is a fairly passive sort of look at what faith is. Young people tend to be more energized by faith in action. They want to see what religious identity looks like when it's lived out in the world. And they seem to like personal and intellectual challenges, right? And I think here, what's happening is they're transitioning from childhood to adulthood, right? And so they want to be given challenges, to make things their own, to explore the world in a way where they don't feel like they're being sheltered, where they're not being treated like children, even though in some ways they are, in some ways they aren't. And so personal intellect and intellectual challenges, they actually seem to do really well with. They seem to really, really enjoy them at the end of the day. Another thing that tends to be really detrimental to young adults, teenager and emerging adult faith, is a perception of hypocrisy. And hypocrisy, and the perception, especially that trusted figures are hypocritical, can be just as damaging as any form of sacred loss, right? And it can honestly lead to people losing their faith. You can think of, obviously you're all too young, more or less, to remember this, but following, the revelation of the sex abuse scandals in 2002 in the Roman Catholic Church, tons of people walked away from the faith. Some people, altogether walked away from faith completely. Other people, maybe went to evangelicalism, or not infrequently, you could do like what Rod Dreher did and become Eastern Orthodox. But hypocrisy, and especially hypocrisy among trusted leaders, really hurts. It's taken personally, and it can lead to a major loss of faith. Young people, too, are critical of oversimplified answers and being talked down to, and especially treated as children. They're moving into the realm of adulthood, and they want adult answers, even if they struggle at times to deal with them. So like I was saying on, last slide, pat answers really kind of don't do it for people. You need to be moving people, if you want to scaffold them into a religious faith that's adult, into a different spot, into asking hard questions and seeking hard answers, and expecting a lot of people seems to be what Pearce and Denton are sort of getting at. So the conclusion that Pearce and Denton draw is that when adults, peers, and congregations kind of work together to meet adolescents where they are, in that process of examining beliefs, of working out what it is to go from the faith of a child to the faith of an adult, the social results are generally good for teens, even if you don't always get the result that you want in terms of where they end up in faith, right? Sometimes they end up personalizing it. They take the pieces that are available to them, and you never know exactly what pieces are available, right? Because you never know all the inputs in terms of peers and all this stuff. And they create a personal religious mosaic. It may not look like, say, what the religious institution wanted it to be, but they do end up personalizing it in some way. So what does meeting adolescents where they are at look like? Letting people question their beliefs and supporting their search for answers, not shutting things down, giving pat answers, adjusting forms of practice to meet their needs, right? And here, there's often, especially for religious communities, there are ways that religious communities do things, and they're deeply entrenched. Just go to even what we would think of as a low church, a church which is very unstructured, like an evangelical church. Ask them to change something in their service, and I almost guarantee you will meet with nothing but a ton of resistance. Because people like the way things are, and institutions tend to go on momentum. But adjusting practice to meet the needs of adolescents is a good thing. It helps them work through and giving them leadership roles, right? And then fitting in religion with other activities and commitments, right? Finding ways so it's not all encompassing and so that it's part of other things. And if we do this, right, if you undertake this process, youth are more likely to figure out their religious identities and less likely to just be pulled in whatever direction the social currents are pulling them, right? And so a more intentional, and this is a hard path, right? This is why I think a lot of religious communities tend to go the pat answers route and the over scaffolding route in a lot of cases, or sometimes, if you're a mainline Protestant, the under scaffolding route. This is a difficult process, right? But the result is, often, like I said, not necessarily an image of faith that the adults in a community are going to be 100% comfortable with, but it is someone who's worked out their religious identity and hasn't ended up, say, just in a place of like MTV, right? Where it's just like, well, this is what everybody believes. I've actually worked it out. I've actually spent the time thinking about it. And this, I think, is ultimately, very valuable. Whatever the result is, having people who thought carefully about their religious identity, at the end of the day, I think is a good thing. So, successful scaffolding is, I think, what every parent, every peer, every religious community ought to be kind of working towards with adolescents and with emerging adults who are working out religious identities.